Good morning and welcome to the first meeting of 2026 in Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have apologies today from Paul O'Kane and Marie McNair will be joining us remotely. Our only public agenda item this morning is an evidence session following up on the committee's report on the operation of the public sector equality duty in Scotland, which was published last year. The public sector equality duty is a legal requirement for public authorities in Scotland. Under the duty, they must consider equality when carrying out their functions. We will hear this morning from the Equality and Human Rights Commission and the Minister for Equalities. I therefore welcome our first panel, representing the Equality and Human Rights Commission, John Wilkes, Head of Scotland, and Jennifer Lachlan, Head of Scotland Legal. You're all very welcome and thank you for joining us. I refer members to papers 1 and 2. And before we move to questions, may I ask John to make a brief opening statement, please?
Thank you very much, Convener, and Happy New Year to the committee. We'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to comment on your report into the effectiveness of the public sector equality duty in Scotland and share our thoughts on its recommendations and the Scottish Government response. I think the first thing to say is the evidence submissions and oral evidence sessions and final report highlight many issues which we agree with and which we reflected, hopefully, in the contributions we gave to the committee last year. The evidence heard by the committee chimes with the Commission's decade-long experience of regulating and monitoring the effectiveness of the current Scottish-specific duties. Our evidence base has been built up through our 2013 to 2017 Measuring Up project, which monitored the PSED in Scotland, and our ongoing regulatory work, which takes a more project-focused approach around themes and sectors. This work provides a valuable insight into how the public sector still has work to do in understanding and meeting their current public sector equality duty obligations and how improvements can be made. We agree with the committee that there is a need for reform of the PSED. In 2022, we used our experience to develop a clear set of recommendations as to how, in our opinion, the duties could be changed to improve the performance of public authorities. And this informed our engagement with the Scottish Government and our ongoing engagement with them on their work to reform the Scottish-specific duties. Regulation is not an end in itself, of course, but a framework to enable public bodies and services to achieve the three main goals of the general duty, which I think are worth restating here, which is to eliminate discrimination, to advance equal opportunities, and to foster good relations between people with and without protected characteristics. We are clear that targeted improvements to the existing regulations are key to better consideration of equality issues and to improve fostering good relations and place more focus on the importance of setting clear equality outcomes. Some of the key recommendations we made to government included amending the regulations to require that equality outcomes be accompanied by published evidence-informed action plans, that ensuring regulatory inspection bodies in Scotland play a clearer role through their inspections and ongoing engagement in monitoring and improving public sector equality duty performance and improvement. Ensuring public body reporting cycles could be better aligned, and government using its leadership role in considering setting national and sectoral equality outcomes. We are also clear that strong leadership and clear guidance will assist public bodies in understanding and meeting the requirements of the duties. We welcome some of the initiatives that the government has more recently put in place, including its first use of Regulation 11 and its mainstreaming guidance and toolkits. However, we share the committee's view that the regulatory reforms currently proposed by government, while a step in the right direction, do not achieve the full potential that could be achieved by public authorities in utilising the PSED requirements. The Commission remains committed to continue to play our part as the regulator of these duties through the provision of guidance and support, working with public bodies to improve their performance, and where necessary, using our enforcement powers to ensure that public bodies are meeting their obligations under these duties. A more effective framework will help the public sector achieve better improvements and performance of public services in Scotland, and we remain committed to work with Government, Parliament and other key stakeholders in achieving this aim. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to questions. I'm going to start us off. The committee found that the PSED is not delivering on its aims for improved outcomes for people with protected characteristics. Why do you think it has failed to achieve this?
Gosh, yes, there's a number of reasons about that. We feel there's still a fundamental lack of understanding in many public bodies about what the public duties are there to do. And some of the work that public bodies do is quite high level and very process focused. And we think that there needs to be a shift in terms of public bodies thinking in terms of what the duties are there to help them with, which is to develop quality outcomes over certain periods to help achieve the three main pillars of the general duty. There's an awful lot of guidance, and we've produced, and we like to think we've produced some really excellent technical guidance and other guidance to support all aspects of how to operate the duties, including what due regard means, including how to do fostering good relations, and all the other things that the committee picked up in its report that could be improved. We also think that there could be better direction and leadership from bodies like the Scottish Government in setting national and sectoral equality outcomes where that is appropriate. But within public bodies themselves, there's still, in many cases, the understanding of how PSED should be used is still very top, and it's not maybe understood throughout the whole of a public body. That it should be second nature, we would hope, for everybody working in the public sector to think, as people think about all sorts of other things like health and safety and those sort of things in their day-to-day work, or when they're developing policies or developing services, what are the equality considerations? What would we put into the equality impact assessment when we're thinking about that? Also, I think there is still a challenge in terms of accessing good equality data. I know that can be very challenging. The Commission absolutely recognised it, that for certain public bodies, in terms of their workforces, which may not have a big workforce, that can be challenging. But in terms of gathering data from outside, the government's Equality Data Improvement Project, which we've been a part of over the last few years, has been a good step in looking at how, across government and the public sector, we can find better ways of developing good equality data. So those are some of the things, I think, as to why public bodies... I think it's also important to say that progress has been made since the introduction of the specific duties in 2012 and subsequent ones in 2016. So it's not all bleak, and there are certain good examples within the public sector where the equality duty has achieved change and progress. But there's still lots more to do.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if you want to add anything.
I don't think so, John.
Okay.
That was quite comprehensive.
Okay, thank you. We now have questions from Tess White, please.
Thank you, convener. John, do I address you as John, or is it Mr. Wilkes?
Oh, no, John.
Thank you. And Jennifer, the same?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for coming this morning. It's long awaited. We've been waiting almost a year. So thank you for coming this morning. So my first question, John and Jennifer, is what is the EHRC doing to help public authorities focus on outcomes rather than processes? And you've talked just then about having good quality leadership, yes. But why do you think it's so difficult for public bodies to actually deliver on this?
Yeah, well, in terms of the first part of your question about what are we doing, we recognise that many different stakeholders think we're not doing enough. A lot of what we do, though, is sort of behind the scenes, and we get regular inquiries from members of the public or organisations pointing us to saying that local authority X or health board Y or the police haven't followed their... And there's a lot of that goes on, which says to me that there's an increasing awareness out there about the role of public sector equality duties, and we do follow up on those things. In terms of the work we're doing, one good example, I think, is the work we have done with the Scottish Funding Council, which is the funder and part regulator of the higher and further education sector in Scotland. And following our inquiry in 2020-2021, looking at racial harassment in universities, the response of the Scottish Funding Council was to say, what can we do to combat that? And where we ended up, we entered into a formal memorandum of understanding where we work with them and through them work with the higher and further education sector to develop national equality outcomes for that sector, appropriate to that sector. That doesn't stop individual universities and further education institutions developing other equality outcomes, but we think that's a really good approach of approaching sectorally what could be some of the issues. And we've just recently reviewed it because we've been through one cycle of that and we've just started the second cycle in terms of setting equality outcomes for the 2025 period. And I think something like, I may get the numbers wrong, but 40 out of 42 of the institutions involved have adopted the national equality outcomes. We're just doing a bit of evaluation research, which we hope to be able to publish later, about how effective or what the impact of those has been in the first cycle. So that's one example of where we're working with a sector within the public sector. Another example would be in 2022, I think, we were drawn to the fact that the integrated joint boards, which obviously commission social care within Scotland, that they clearly didn't understand that they had responsibilities around the PSED, and I think we found something like 30 out of 31 of them weren't meeting their PSED obligations. So we approached the sector and worked with both chief executives and boards and staff to work with them over a year to help them understand what their actual obligations were and how to do it. And when we revisited that last year, I think all of them were compliant to the basic standards of PSED. So those are sort of examples where we do targeted work. Obviously, there are situations where public bodies maybe are failing a bit more, and then we can use our enforcement powers, which Jennifer can talk about. And I think there's been examples where we've worked with organisations in the last few years. Scottish Qualifications Authority is one that springs to mind, and Scottish Legal Aid Board, where for different reasons we understood that there were perhaps failings in their responsibilities around PCA, and we go through what's called a Section 23 agreement, where an organisation agrees to work with us on an agreed plan. So those are some of the examples that we would say in terms of how we're approaching this situation. And obviously there's the ongoing issue about projection of guidance, updating guidance, and all the other things that go with that. I think there was a second part to your question about why is the understanding. I think I would refer to comments in the opening statement, and there's still a lot of work to do to help the understanding of why these things are important and what their obligations are. But we would say that we are fortunate in Scotland that we have this secondary duties, and that has been real help, I think, in terms of helping public bodies to better understand what their requirements are. And if you compare that where we work with colleagues in the EHRC in terms of England's situation, where there aren't the same landscape as secondary duties, I think you can see some of the differences and the advantages we do have, but there's still a long way to go. And I think the other thing I would probably say is there's still a sort of very much a process focus on the equality duties that public bodies have. They're very used to processes. So they see it as, oh, this is another process we have to follow, rather than seeing it as it's a tool to help us address certain equality, discrimination issues that we can work with over a longer period of time. If you want to
we are pressed for time,
Sorry,
so Jennifer, I know that later on we will be covering the outcome, so if I can just focus on that question. And as a region MSP, I cover several education authorities, IJBs and the councils, and I've had extensive meetings, and I do want to, in this section, give you a local example. But before I do that, can I ask about the Scottish Government short-term working group that was established in April 2025 on taking forward the Supreme Court judgment? And I looked at it last night, so I went again and I looked at it to look at the composition, and I noticed on the website, as of last night, it said the minutes suggest that the EHRC is active in engagement. So that's on the website. And they talk about the EHRC as a key stakeholder. So in relation to that, and I couldn't get it off the website, so may I ask you, what advice did the EHRC give to this short-term working group? Because I noticed that there is no minutes since last August.
Yes, so in response to the judgment, I think is what you're referring to, the Supreme Court judgment of last year.
I'm referring to the short-term working committee. And
the government has said and stated that they accept the outcomes of the judgment, and that to address that within government, they've set up a short life working group to look across the whole span of their government policies, regulations, and all the rest of it, to identify what needs to be changed. Our chief executive met with ministers, I think, in June of last year to get a sense of the progress that's being made. Our advice to government, as our advice is to all public bodies in this regard, is that the judgment is there. It's up to public bodies to take such advice or to do such things as they need to make sure that they are compliant with that judgment. We've received updates in the sense of we're told that the group is still working. Yesterday, our chair happens to be in Scotland this week, and she and our chief executive met with Cabinet Secretary and Equalities Minister, and they said that the scope of the work is obviously quite large if you're thinking about trying to apply the judgment across the whole of all the policies that government have to do, and that it's effectively not a short-term working group anymore. It's a longer piece of work, and that they're working their way through addressing all the issues. They pointed to some examples of things that they've amended, such as the schools guidance and things like that, and also identified other areas where they didn't feel there were any changes that need to be made. But government is quite huge, so there's a lot to go through.
So the way I interpret that answer is not much has happened with the short-term working group. It's stalled, not much engagement, but it's almost like it's been put onto one side and separate meetings have taken place with the government. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't think I would articulate it like that, no. I mean, our role isn't to be part of the working group. Our role isn't to be there checking their homework, if you like. We very much urged them and continue to urge them to do as swiftly as is possible all the things they need to do to ensure that they're compliant with the judgment. I think the impression that we got from the meeting yesterday is that it's a huge exercise and they're working their way through actively and at pace, is what they said, to deal with all the implications. So we didn't get the sense they're not doing anything, they're just working their way systematically through an awful lot of material.
But it does say on the website that you are, the EHRC is a key stakeholder. I have one definition of a key stakeholder that seems to be different, and it does also say that MSPs will be kept updated.
Yes.
We haven't been kept updated, and it's quite obvious that you're not seen as a key stakeholder, otherwise you'd have had it said it was going to meet every 2 weeks, and then it started to meet monthly. So you've mentioned one meeting.
Yes.
So thank you, you've given the answer to the question. So my second question is, the law is clear following the Supreme Court judgment, which you've mentioned.
Yeah.
So has the EHRC started work on an awareness campaign for employers so that there are no more repeated tribunals like the Peggy case? And as we know, the law is clear. The old technical guidance, and I've gone and I've asked officers in my community which guidance they're following, and it seems that even though in parts the old technical guidance has been taken down, and there's a view that it needs, to be direct, needs binning, because employers are still relying on it and it's still being referenced in court cases. So is there a workaround? Has the EHRC got a workaround with this sort of muddle that we're in right now, that people are referring to old guidance that should be binned?
Well, the main thing that we've done since the judgment is obviously update the Code of Practice on Services, which we had been working on anyway. During 2024, we did a big review of that code because it's 2011, it's out of date and it needs updating. And then we had to do, as you know, a sort of second exercise following the Supreme Court judgment to revisit and look at those parts of the code that required amendment because of the judgment, which wasn't the whole code, it's just specific parts of that. So that exercise has been completed, and that, as you'll be aware, I guess, is with UK ministers, and it's really in their ballpark to progress and lay that code. There are obviously all sorts of other guidance that we have that require to be updated, and that will need a rolling programme of activity. There's also the Code of Practice on Employment, which I think is on our... But you'd be better placed to...
I mean, at the moment, we're working on the schools technical guidance in England, Scotland and Wales, and the Employment Code is part of our planned programme of work. In terms of your question around like the status of the current code and what we intend to do about that, I might have to take that one away and get back to the committee on that, because I'm not sure exactly if we what the
and that's mentioned on the short-term working group. So thank you, Jennifer. Can I go? And I am going to give a local example, but before I do, and as MSPs, we're regularly engaging with you mentioned the IJBs and the chief executive and the council officers. But how, in your view, has the EHRC helped employers so they don't fall foul of the law?
Well, we help employers in a number of different ways, mainly through the guidance that we produce. I mean, there are thousands of employers across Scotland and Britain, and some are in public sector and many are in the private sector. I mean, the role of the EHRC is to, where employers are needing to engage in understanding and implementing the impacts of, for public bodies, the PSCD, but for other bodies, the Equality Act more generally, it's their responsibility to ensure that they're compliant. There are instances where we might use our enforcement powers to engage on particular cases that come up. We keep being informed by our evidence gathering about what's happening out there, but we are a relatively small regulator in the whole scheme of things. So our main support for employers is through the guidance we produce. We will engage where we need to, and in certain circumstances where we think we need to use our enforcement powers, we will do that. So I suppose an example of that would be the engagement we've had currently with McDonald's. There were lots of issues raised with us about sexual harassment in McDonald's, so we've entered into an agreement with them to help them as an employer deal with that particular issue. So that's an example of where we can use our powers strategically and sectorally to do that.
And that's fine, and that's a private sector, but over the 100, we pulled a list together, there are over 100 public sector bodies, organisations within Scotland, and I would have expected the HRC to do a gap analysis against the 9 protected characteristics and to see, because it is quite clear that many of those are not following the law. Can I give you my local example? So, and this has generated much of my caseload over the last year. And I want to speak and give 2 examples of 2 swimming pools in my own area, one in Aberdeen City and one in Aberdeenshire. And it matters because one of the swimming pools was threatened with closure in Aberdeen City. It's Bucksburn Swimming Pool. And it was the only swimming pool in Aberdeen City that was single-sex changing, and women with disabilities. And so there are 3 protected characteristics there: women with disabilities and women of elderly. And the local community fought tooth and nail to keep the swimming pool open, because people came from all around Aberdeen City, all around Aberdeenshire, so that they could go safely in privacy, because it takes extra time if you've got, I've got the Alzheimer's badge, if you take extra time if you've got disabilities. And the swimming pool was threatened with closure. Now, fortunately, the community, including mental health, one of the mental health workers, who said basically it is a lifeline, both physically with the disabilities, but psychologically. So the community got together and kept the swimming pool open, had to go to court, take the council to court. And one of the guarantees was that it would keep the single sex. But bearing in mind, it's the only one in Aberdeen City and one of the few in the northeast. I'll give another example of Stonehaven swimming pool. Stonehaven swimming pool did a refit. It went to mixed facilities. So women complained, I even took it as far as the chief executive of the council. The head of legal was here in front of our committee giving feedback on the PSED, and basically they still said they were going ahead with the refit. Women and women with disabilities, even some of the men have actually said that they don't feel comfortable changing in front of little girls and they've got mixed showers. So the complaints were just dismissed. My complaints were just dismissed. When I raised it with the director of the council, he said we were waiting for the Peggy case. The Peggy case has come out. So, you know, in terms of that, and you talk about your enforcement powers, but it's as basic as swimming. It has hugely negatively affected so many people's lives, and yet, including myself as the MSP, we're all being dismissed and saying, we're waiting. And that is Aberdeen City that have kept one pool, Aberdeenshire that basically says, we're not breaking any laws, whatever, not listening to the community, not listening to me as the MSP. Angus Council is a separate one where you've got teachers actually saying, oh, well, I actually like the mixed-sex changing facilities because I can keep an eye on the children. But what about the young girls? And my final point, we did a study, and if you haven't read it, I'm happy to share it with you. It's while I was on the Health and Sport Committee. And we did a huge inquiry into why are women and girls excluding from sport. And if you overlay the other protected characteristics, I mean, it's not rocket science that women and girls are self-excluding. But that report hasn't been taken forward, and it's obvious why, and to the inquiry as well. So in terms of the EHRC, and this is my question, and I have rambled a bit, but I'm here speaking passionately about the women with disabilities, the children, the men who don't feel comfortable when they're in the mixed-sex facilities. And there was a report, which I'm quite happy to share with you, from the Women's Rights Network, that actually said that only 6 of the 31 responding local authorities, they did an FOI on all the local authorities, offer any form of women-only swimming session. And of those, only 3 sessions, that's just 10%, are guaranteed to be genuinely single-sex. So my question, John and Jennifer, is, given the public sector equality duty requires public bodies to advance equality of opportunity between women and men, what steps, if any, have you taken to understand this problem and give guidance so that local authorities, such as the 3 that I've mentioned, and leisure trusts, because it's not they give a lot of their management to leisure trusts, provide lawful, clearly advertised and genuinely single-sex swimming sessions and changing facilities for women and girls and men, especially those with disabilities, particularly in the light of evidence showing widespread inconsistency, I've talked about following the old rules, and misunderstandings of the Equality Act 2010, and not just in my own region, but across Scotland.
I think, as John mentioned earlier, we do have guidance on the public sector equality duty, and that would cover organisations in the public sector's duties to do things like carry out equality impact assessments. So they should be considering, before they make decisions, what all the different protected characteristics and how those decisions are going to impact them. As you'll be aware, we've also, and as John also spoke about earlier, we've also recently revised our services code and then had to revise it again in the light of the Supreme Court judgment. So that would give specific guidance to organisations that are providing services to members of the public, which obviously swimming pools would come under. That is currently, as you know, with the Minister in Westminster, and has been for some time, and we are we're trying to provide additional information so that can be laid as soon as possible.
But the Supreme Court judgment was just a clarification of the law. The Equality Act has been in place since 2010. There are 9 protected characteristics. So I've given 3 examples, one in Angus of the school children, one in Aberdeen City and one in Aberdeenshire. I recognise there are only 20 employees of the HRC in Scotland, but if this is about enforcement and equality of opportunity, and we're being dismissed, and politicians representing are being dismissed, what enforcement have you been doing since 2010, and including leisure centres and swimming pools?
So I'm not aware of us having done anything specifically in relation to leisure centres and swimming pools. But as as you point out yourself, we do have limited resources. I've got 3 solicitors under me at the moment, so that's not a lot to cover the whole of Scotland. A lot of our focus recently has been on guidance. We have taken enforcement action, and John mentioned a couple against public bodies in the recent past. We do a lot of work in terms of public sector equality duty, which is sort of described as compliance or pre-enforcement work, where we become aware of situations like you describe. We would look into what's happening and try to work with the organisation so that they are looking at their equalities duties and properly complying with them. And that's probably most of the time that helps, and we don't need to go further to formal enforcement action. But where we do need to, we will. We haven't done that, I don't think, and to my knowledge, in relation to leisure centres specifically. No. But if we, if we became aware that that was a problem and it was something that we had the resource to do, then it's something that we would, we would consider in the same way that we would consider any complaints that are made to us about matters that any matters that suggest any situation where there's a suggestion that the public sector's equality duties not being complied with. We would look into that. We would take proportionate measures in relation to that. And as I say, if we felt that enforcement was necessary, and as I say, we do have a lot of competing priorities, so we're not going to take enforcement action in every single case, but we do it. And just because we have limited resources, and maybe some of our focus is in the last few months has been more on our guidance and on pre-enforcement rather than the harder-edged enforcement. I wouldn't like any public authorities to think that we are not in the business of taking enforcement action, because we still are, and we will do that where it is required. And as I say, we may not have the resource to do it every single time we realise that there's a problem, but we will consider every problem that is brought to us and take enforcement action where in the ones where we feel that that's the only way that we're going to
thank you. And I'm conscious of time. The report, we have 11 weeks to go. So if I come to the EHRC and I give you examples in the North East of what's happening with the data from the FOIs, that you will work with me and you will consider enforcements where appropriate.
We would triage that in line with our processes.
So I wouldn't be dismissed as I have been for the last few years by local authorities, whatever. I will come to you. Thank you. Back to you, convener.
I think very quickly add,
yes,
the primary responsibility still rests with public authorities in their business and the thousands of decisions they make on services and all the rest of it, to follow their obligations. And our job, as Jennifer has outlined, is to assist them in doing that. As I say, again, to restate, that is primarily through the provision of guidance, through working with public authorities where we can to help them improve their practice, and thirdly, where there are issues that are brought to our attention, to consider whether it's appropriate for us to take action and what that action would be. And just to say, I think every week we get lots of inquiries about where people have questioned whether a public authority is meeting its obligations, and we do a lot of triaging on that, and we take appropriate responses where we can, but it has to be borne in mind in terms of the overall landscape, and we're trying to be a strategic regulator in that regard. But we consider everything that is brought to our attention, and we try to respond appropriately to that.
I hear you, but even I was feeling quite positive after Jennifer's, but then I almost feel now this is priority 10 after paper clips. And,
no, not at all.
And and you can see I feel strongly about this.
Absolutely.
My background's HR. I'm a fellow of the Institute of Personnel. In the private sector, I'd have gone as the enforcer, and anybody who wasn't delivering on the requirements of the organisation, there would be consequences. Right now, there are no consequences, and as this report that this committee has produced is a damning report of what's happening in the public sector organisations. So, John, with respect, actually saying we will review it, I'd just like to say I will come to you because it's not happening. And I accept, Jennifer, that you've only got 20 staff and you are limited and you're looking at... But the system is broken, and women with disabilities have come to me and said, Tess, please, can we start to go swimming? Because it's affecting our physical health and it's affecting our mental health. So thank you. Back to you, Convener.
Okay. Thank you. We now have questions from Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning both. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I want to focus a little bit on balancing characteristics and fostering good relations. A bugbear of mine for some years now is that there's been limited understanding and virtually no conversation about what fostering good relations means, and you've picked that up as well. It's been very much the poor cousin of the different elements of the public sector equality duty. I wonder, could you say, why do you think fostering good relations is so hard for public bodies to grasp, both the meaning of and what it looks like, and what in your view, would a good process and practice of fostering good relations look like?
Okay. Yeah, as we said in our evidence to you last year, and as you have picked up in your report, it's one of the 3 pillars of the general duty that is the least, in our view, developed as far as public sector responses to that. I mean, why? There could be many reasons for that. I think because it can be quite challenging, I think, for public authorities to sort of think about what does this actually mean when we're doing our business. How do we promote and address some of the competing priorities that can emerge, competing risks between different protected characteristics, and some of the tensions that can arise from that, and fostering good relations is a tool and a way of looking at those considerations. And so obviously some of the ongoing current debates is around the tensions and issues between sex and women, and trans is one area where a fostering good relations approach could help to navigate your way through how do you meet the needs of both communities who are both protected by the Equality Act in that regard. It could be to do with policing and how fostering good relations tensions between different communities, such as different communities of race, and some of the things we're seeing in the communities that we are going on at the moment. So we would like to see a lot more work and recognition by public authorities when they're setting their equality outcomes to think about these aspects as well. And as I said in our earlier answers, we've got guidance on our website around this stuff, which talks about fostering good relations, and I think we've done some updates in the code as well, haven't we, which will hopefully be coming out soon to help. So there is the information and evidence. I think it's about confidence as well by public bodies to start to tackle these issues, which can often be quite tricky, I think.
I'm going to come to the guidance in a moment, but when you talk about confidence, do you mean confidence in doing something, or confidence in understanding what it means? Because I think those are 2 different things, and I see weaknesses in both. Which are you referring to?
I think I would agree that there is about understanding and then confidence in doing something about it. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
If you wanted to add.
Jennifer, did you want to come in?
No, I think that's... Unless you've got any supplementary questions.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I suppose with the guidance, one of the questions, and John, you talked about how the police could take a fostering good relations approach in managing different situations where race and ethnicity and other characteristics in that space are causing flashpoints in communities. has EHRC actually had conversations with Police Scotland about that? And can you give us a little bit more detail about that? Because I think as we see, you know, I think great frustration on the parts of many communities and many people across Scotland, the rising levels of hate, you know, people of colour being targeted on the streets and the police doing nothing about it, or being seen to do nothing about it. What can you just shed a little bit of light on the work you've done with the police on these issues?
Yes, I mean, obviously there are balances to be made here in terms of policing, and it's a difficult role to get right. I mean, one of the things we're doing with police is part of our uniform services project, which we've been doing for a couple of years. That is about tackling the evidence that does exist about sexism and racism that exists within the police force itself, you know, in terms of employment. And this is a project we're doing across Britain, and in Scotland we are engaging with Police Scotland and Scottish Police Authority and Majesty's Inspectorate, and also fire service as well. And although that has an internal focus, our sense would be if we can help them get that better in terms of attitudes within the police, then that will help in terms of how they then comport themselves when dealing with the public. So that is one example of where we're actively currently working with the uniformed services, because there seems to be evidence that suggests that uniformed services tend to have a cultural ethos that somehow leads to high levels of sexism, racism and other things. And that's one of the things we're trying to do at the moment.
Okay. Do you get the sense in any of your conversations with Police Scotland as part of the Uniformed Service Project or beyond that, the notion of balancing needs, not necessarily balancing risks, but not balancing needs, is sometimes used as an excuse to do nothing?
I'm not sure I'd articulate it quite like that, but I think sometimes there is a sense of feeling of difficulty about how to tackle these issues, I would say. Again, we would hope that the work we're doing on the Uniform Services Project will help open up some of those debates and topics and improve practice. And I'm pleased to say that both Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority are really committed and engaged to working with us on that process.
And is there a role for political leadership in this as well? How would you see the sort of political context of debates and discussions around race feeding into some of that? And what can we as parliamentarians, what can you as the EHRC, what can, you know, all of us who have an interest and responsibility around this notion of fostering good relations, what should we be doing differently?
I think that political leadership is important in these debates, and I know as politicians you have engagements all the time with public bodies on a variety of different issues, and introducing these concepts into those conversations I think can be helpful, can remind public bodies of their obligations in this regard. As Tess has said in terms of the examples she's given around her engagement in Aberdeenshire, so that can be really helpful. But we also have to recognise in terms of racism that we're currently in a climate of growing racism because of all the debates that are ongoing, issues linked to immigration and all of those sorts of things. So we're living in a time when these things are on the increase, and it's important on everybody who is in public life, and our role as a regulator as well, to try and put a sense of the fact that we have a human rights framework and an equalities framework, and those can be frameworks within which we can have dialogues where we have differences of view, and that rights are for everybody. And I think we're losing, or the risk is losing some of those what maybe have been accepted as the sort of frameworks within which we operate as a society and as communities. But it's work that is difficult and needs continual focus.
Okay, I suppose I'm what am I trying to get at here? I think it's easy, and I'm not suggesting that this is what you're doing at all, but I think it's sometimes easy for regulators and for people who aren't politicians to say, oh, we can't get involved in the political, or we can't get involved in the politics. And I think actually it is, as you've just said, it is all of our jobs to make sure we actually do get involved and we do have those conversations. If I can change tack a little bit, in your opening remarks you talked about, I think it was actually in an answer to Karen's question. You talked about your work, your sectoral work with the SFC and higher and further education. Given some of the some of the fertile territory for debate and discussion are in exactly those institutions, how do you see both colleges and universities understanding the fostering good relations element? Because I think we've seen some pretty poor examples of understanding in that, particularly around sex and gender related issues. And I just wondered how that work features in the conversations and work you've done with the SFC and institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see the advantage of working in that way with sectors where that's appropriate, that in terms of trying to get agreement on a set of national equality outcomes within those, we can start to look at developing some of those which are around addressing fostering good relations. And I think one of the advantages of doing it sectorally is it gives confidence to everybody in that sector that they're just not the only one trying to do it. I mean, this is only the second tranche of equality outcomes we're about to launch. As I say, we're going to do an evaluation on the first set about what impact has it had in terms of improving higher education, further education institutes' understanding generally of their PSED obligations. Have they found using a common set of national equality outcomes as well as their own outcomes that for each institution will also develop? We think that there are potentials to do that in other big public sector, such as health, for example. That could be another area where we could adopt this approach and encourage that approach. I think that the other thing we would say is that ministers also have a role, government has a role, and I think the recent publication of the Ministers' Regulation 12 report, where they've set out issues that they're going to be tackling, are helpful signals. And also the use of the Regulation 11, where the Minister has drawn the attention of public bodies to look at certain issues. And we were very pleased to see that it's now being used. That was the purpose of that regulation, is that where appropriate, government nationally can say, there are these key things that are going on at the moment that public authorities need to keep a focus on, or should have a focus on as part of their general adherence to public sector equality duties and other things. So it's all these elements together I think could help move this agenda forward.
Okay, thanks. And I should just put on record my interest as Rector of Dundee University, given we were talking about SFC matters there. Question, I suppose, and you sort of hinting at some of it there, but taking this notion of how we understand and how we promote fostering good relations as a tool, as you say, how could the government and local authorities better incorporate it into budget conversations, not only budget decisions, but all the conversations that lead up to decisions?
Budgeting is really, really important, and that's an area that we think could be a real lever in terms of applying public sector equality duty as part of the budgeting process. Because if you're starting to introduce that thinking into terms of how you're applying your resources, then that will help, we think, public authorities to sort of think about these things in a different way.
If I can just...
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a general understanding that that's what we should be doing, but specifically about fostering good relations, how do you see that linking into budgetary conversations?
I think if there is a clearer link between organisations setting their budgets and doing appropriate equality impact assessments as part of that, then you can start to introduce all elements of the 3 pillars of the duty into those discussions. And I think that would be a way of starting to engage where people aren't engaged at the moment in those concepts. And budgeting, I think there has been improvements made. I mean, we're part of the government's Equality and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group. So at a national level, trying to ensure that setting the national budget, is woven in absolutely with equality obligations, and obviously that's human rights obligations as well, is a way of starting to shift the mindset about how resources need to follow need, and need in terms of the different needs of people who have different protected characteristics. Still a way to go, yeah, I would say, on that. But that is certainly a way we think could help improve the situation and move things forward.
Okay, thanks. And my final very quick question, is there a shining example of good fostering good relations that you could give us?
Is there a shining example?
That's a tricky one to put us on the spot.
But I mean, it's possibly indicative that there isn't. I mean, there might be, but I struggle to find one. If you find one, please let us know.
We will do.
If you find one, please let us know.
Will do. Thank you. Thanks, Karen.
Another question from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Thank you for the information you've provided so far. Can you confirm that the Commission has changed its position on recording sex based on self-ID since the publication of the Chief Statistician's 2021 guidance by agreeing that it is necessary to collect data on biological sex for equality monitoring?
Sorry, when you say have we changed our position, is that what you're asking?
That the Commission, yeah.
So the Commission was involved in helping or providing our perspective when the Chief Statistician introduced the guidance back in 2021, I think.
21, yeah.
Obviously, the situation has changed with the Supreme Court judgment. And in fact, the matter of how the government was recording its own workforce-based data using its guidance has been brought to our attention in the last couple of weeks or so. So we're currently looking at that.
Okay, you're currently looking at that,
Yeah.
yeah. But you know the importance, obviously, for equality monitoring, that there has to be clarity on collecting that data, and that's one of the areas that there is a big gap in at the moment, collecting data. You're fully aware of that?
Absolutely. As we said in our opening remarks, in the issue, one of the challenges of progression in terms of public sector equality duties is the lack of good equality data in many different ways. And there are challenges in gathering in that. It's not, and you've mentioned guidance around gathering data for men and women or sex, but there are equally challenges around how you gather information on all the different types of disability, all the different ethnicities, and so on. That is an ongoing issue, and we are pleased to work with the government in their Equality Data Improvement Project in trying to find better ways or improve the gathering of such data, because without the data, it's really hard then to set good equality outcomes. It's really hard to understand your fostering good relations duty, but we recognise the challenges that are involved because some of the communities that are involved are quite small, and how to ensure appropriate data collection and don't compromise individuals in that regard. And I think that's, if I can sort of shift a bit to the proposals that we understand the government are going to bring in terms of pay gap reporting for ethnicity and disability, which is one of the reforms we think the government is intending to introduce. I mean, how you, one of the concerns we have is how do you introduce a system that looks at ethnicity pay gaps and disability pay gaps when there are a very large spread of different types, as opposed to gender pay gap, which is much more binary between men and women. So the point you raise about data is really important, and it's an ongoing issue that we try to play our part in helping develop. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I don't think I've got much to add to that really, John, but yeah, we would always kind of encourage people to make sure that when they're gathering data, that they're thinking about the purposes of that, and if the purpose of that is compliance, you know, and what one of the purposes of that is in order to comply with the Equality Act, to carry out their public sector equality duties, then they need to ensure that they're collecting that in an appropriate way, that they're able to like measure things going on. And as John said, we have found that is a, you know, that has been a challenge sometimes in the past, that you know, organisations just not having good enough quality data, which really is the starting point if they're going to make any improvements.
No, it's good to hear that, you know, that you base the importance around that to have that monitoring, that it's important to have that biological sex good data. Can I ask, do you agree that the Scottish Government should therefore withdraw the 2021 guidance, which still encourages data collection based on self-ID?
Well, as I say, we are recently looking at that, and there may be other elements that we need to think through and consider. I think the government, in terms of answer to, I think it was, I can't remember which member's question it was around, I think it was Tess, around the Scottish Government's programme to meet its obligations and following the Supreme Court judgment. That clearly will be one of the things that they'd need to look at as they work their way through.
And do you have a timetable on this?
Well, it's the government's timetable, it's not our timetable. They need to work their way through all aspects of their operation in terms of looking at where things need to change as a result of the judgment, where things don't need to change. And but I think it's quite a big project for them, and I'm sure the Minister will be able to elaborate more on that. So we recognise that's a big project. The sense we get is that they are actively working on that and trying to do that as quickly and effectively as they can.
Yeah. But you also understand the fact that you can't compare apples to pears and certain things that you can't provide services for if you don't have the correct data. And to self-ID basically will screw the data up, and especially when it comes down to minorities, that people like coming from an ethnic minority. How will you know that females from an ethnic minority, biological, if it wasn't to do with directly biological sex, that we are discriminated against in any way? So if you basically, I think, bring self-ID in, then people basically wouldn't know the exact data, what's happening. So, you talk about the pay gap there, you talk about other things. I think it's so important that, and don't you agree, that self-ID would basically muddy the waters?
Potentially in some data sets, where you're talking about data sets of sex, your men and women, the proportion that might be captured through self-ID might not have that much impact, but it's important to get the data collection correct and in line with the judgment. So these are sort of some of the issues that we are sort of thinking about in terms of what's been brought before us. So it can be quite complex areas, and it will take a bit of time for us to think about that and go back with our sort of judgment about it. But
Thank you.
Your basic premise is absolutely right. Good quality, accurate data is really important for all aspects.
Thank you. We'll now go to Paul, please.
Thank you, Convener. I'm very conscious of time, so I'll try and keep my questions as brief as I possibly can. Talking about the proposed reforms, the Government talked about, obviously, its mainstreaming strategy, and we'll be asking the Minister around about that. When you come back to the report, I think it's really important, because we're talking about the report in specific, it does mention, obviously, about the role of Scottish Government, and Jennifer, you talked about the role of EHRC and how limited that can be with the staffing you've got. There's also a major emphasis on the role of public authorities, whether that's local authorities or whether that's police or health or whatever. So I suppose the question for me is, what's your thoughts on the Government's evolving approach to this in terms of the mainstreaming, but also in terms of the public authorities as well, because there's a strong onus on public authorities to take ownership of this as well, which I think is really, really important. It just can't wait guidance from the HRC or waiting guidance from Scottish Government. Public authorities have to do, in my opinion, that a little bit more in terms of what they need to do to try and move this in. We've seen, and I think Maggie Chapman talked about, and we'll all come to this from different viewpoints in terms of equality. The big, massive worry I have is the great rise in racism we've seen over, and the whole discourse around about asylum seeking and so on, which really concerns me in terms of that. So that's, but so for me, so coming back to the question is, what more can Scottish Government can do, and what's your thoughts on that? But what really can public authorities do in terms of that, rather than waiting from guidance, rather than from yourself or Scottish Government? What does it need to do to try and move that forward? Because this is all around about data collection, but also about doing the right thing to make sure everybody is treated in an equal manner. So, just what your thoughts are on that.
Sure, thank you. So I'm picking that a bit. In terms of our thoughts on the government's proposed changes, as far as we're aware what they are, in terms of the regulatory changes, we understand, as I said before, that their intention is to extend pay gap reporting from gender pay gap to also looking at ethnicity and disability. And we welcome that in principle. We also were hopeful that there would be other regulatory reforms, as I outlined earlier, with some of the proposals we had made, which aren't being brought forward at this time. I think it's important to say that we have said to government that obviously any regulatory changes they propose, they're obliged to consult with us, because our job at that point is to look at the proposed regulation and determine whether it's something that we could regulate, that we understand, and we can regulate in the sense of further down the line somebody comes to us and says, we think public authority X is in breach of that. It has to be something that's so. And we've said that that process will take us 6 weeks to review those regulations, and our understanding, we're not going to get sight of those until the end of this month. So I suppose we're a bit concerned about whether those regulations will be able to get through the parliamentary process before the end of this parliamentary session, which would be disappointing if we couldn't. In terms of the other initiatives that the government have indicated about the mainstreaming strategy and the toolkit and inclusive communication, those things are all very welcome. We've still yet to see the toolkit ourselves, and I think we're getting a demonstration of that shortly. I think what we would hope is that these things are complementary, but don't overload public bodies with things they need to consider, and that in terms of inclusive communication, I think when we gave our evidence to you last year, we did point out at the time it was being considered as a potential new regulation. We were concerned about how that was going to be framed. I don't think we fully understood what the intention was behind it and how it would interact with the existing reasonable adjustments duty, Section 20 of the Equality Act, which is, although focused on disability, it's a good way for public authorities to look at how they should be ensuring that they communicate effectively for the needs of all different types of communities. Inclusive communication, we understand, is now going to be part of the toolkit and is more guidance rather than regulation. But again, we haven't seen it yet, so we would hope that it's clear and it's clear for public authorities what is expected of them in that regard. And in terms of the other part of the question, if I recall it correctly, which is what public authorities should be doing rather than waiting for guidance, as I said before, these things are currently obligations that public authorities have. They've had for many, many years, and it's their responsibilities to ensure that they are adhering to those obligations, that in terms of the PSED, that they are doing what is required of them, that they are moving forward in terms of setting their equality outcomes to address eliminating discrimination and promotion of equality, that they are bodies that can seek the appropriate advice that they need to where there are fundamental changes, such has been the case with the Supreme Court judgment, that they shouldn't be waiting for guidance that we are producing or other people can produce, that they should be seeking whatever they need in terms of ensuring that they are compliant. I mean, our guidance is there to assist. The Code of Practice will hopefully do that as well, but it is a tool that won't cover every possible eventuality that maybe public authorities will be looking for. I mean, the concept of the code is to translate law into a format that can help authorities in terms of how they need to deal with their obligations. So it's the onus of all public authorities, I think, to not be waiting when there are major changes, but to be carrying on with fulfilling their obligations. If you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, John. And I think, as John said, yeah, the code hopefully will be, when it is laid, will hopefully be a useful tool for people to use and to give them some, you know, sort of practical examples of how they might implement. Not just, you know, everything's sort of focused. A lot of the conversation's been focused on the Supreme Court judgment and the changes that were made in relation to that, but not obviously just not on that topic alone, across the whole range of issues which the Services Code covers. But it doesn't, you know, it doesn't cover everything in detail. We don't know each individual sector as well as that sector knows itself. So I think you're absolutely right to say that they have a responsibility to look at what they should be doing, take their own legal advice where necessary, and sort of get on with trying to make sure that what they're doing is complies with the law and is best practice and so on. As I say, obviously we'll try to assist where we can by providing guidance and by if matters come to our attention that suggest that people are not you know, not doing what they should be doing, that we're, you know, we can hopefully help them to get to a place where they are, or if necessary take enforcement action.
Just one.
The other key area I think that we are disappointed, I guess, that isn't going to be brought forward as part of the reforms is to ensure better engagement of all the other regulators and inspectorates that exist in the Scottish landscape that have better knowledge than we do often of the sectors that they inspect. And we had recommended that the regulations should be framed in a way that would tie them in much more, so that when they were doing their core work and going and inspecting health or schools or whatever, that they were ensuring that as part of that they were sort of checking what the adherence and compliance with the public sector duties is. We think that could be a real way forward in helping improve the capacity and understanding within sectors, because our experience is, while people listen to us and take note of what we say, they are much more focused on their own inspectorates. And we do work regularly with regulators, inspectorates, ombudsmen in Scotland in trying to encourage that, but we feel that, you know, making that link more clearly in the regulations could be a real helpful way forward.
Just one final remark, and John, I think it's a really important point, because when you have a look at the report, there's a part in the report saying this shouldn't just be an add-on for public authorities, it should be an integral part of what they do.
Correct.
I think the inspection regime is an incredibly important part of that. There's a real onus, and I think of course there's a role for Scottish Government, and of course there's a role for the EHRC, but there's a real role on the public authorities themselves to almost self-govern in that self-discipline, and I think that's something that we need to keep focus on as well, not just in terms of government and the EHRC. So it's a closing remark, can be on that. There is that role, I think, John, as you said, of the inspection regimes that are already there.
Yeah.
But thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Just before we head on to Marie McNair for her questions, just to remind members just to be cognisant of the time and witnesses. We will have gone over a little bit of time, but I want to give everybody the opportunity to ask their questions in full as much as possible. So thank you. Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. I was looking to ask about enforcement action, but it's mostly been covered. But I think, you know, establishing and maintaining relationships, as mentioned already, is so important, and being able to provide that support and guidance is key to compliance, I feel. Am I right then that enforcement would be kind of last resort, and that you would continue to work with them first to see if you can down that enforcement route? And are the majority of folk in public bodies and employers complying with their duties? And in terms of like the enforcement action over the past years, the past 5 years, has it decreased then from like sort of year 1 to where we are now in year 5? I hope you've kind of got that. It's quite a lot in that, sorry.
Yeah, so I think in terms of it being a last resort, I would say, I suppose, generally speaking, yes, that depends. You know, there might be situations where something is sort of so bad, if you like, that we feel that that's the only options to go straight to that. But mostly that wouldn't be the first port of call. in terms of your question about what the level of enforcement action over the past 5 years compared to when you started, sorry, I don't have the figures off the top of my head. I'd have to get back to you with that, I'm afraid. But yeah, I would need to provide.
Do you mind kind of like send the written submission in on that?
Yeah,
I think it's
that's
really helpful
fine.
for the committee to just to compare, you know, the last 5 years.
I think I would say that also some of this is before my time as well. That the general way we have approached this since the regulations were introduced in 2012, the first phase of that, our approach was to support and engage public authorities through our guidance, through the direct working we had with them, and I mentioned our Measuring Up project. So in that phase, it was all new for everybody, so we were working to help support. Following that first wave of equality outcomes, then we were in this phase of expecting public authorities to be then much more cognizant with their responsibilities and what they're supposed to be doing. And so we were therefore going into a phase where we were looking more at taking on a compliance approach where we needed to, or in, as Jennifer says, some cases enforcement approaches. So we have a number of tools that we can look to, and we try to pick the most appropriate tool of whatever is presented to us as the situation. And as I said before, that we're trying to be strategic in the way we carry out our regulatory activities, cognizant of our capacity and also what is the best approach. And we find that often approaching a public authority in and of itself is sufficient to get them to do what they needed to do. And so, you know, as I said, we try to match what we can do with the situation. In terms of your question, have public authorities improved their performance? I think, generally speaking, there's a lot of evidence to suggest there has been a sort of improvement in many aspects over the 10 years or so since the regulations, the specific regulations were introduced. But there's a lot more to do, and there is obviously always examples, and some of those have been sort of shared with us today, where things aren't being done properly. And so it just evidences that this is an ongoing, continuous process that we have to keep working at it. If that helps.
Thanks. And obviously that then comes down to, you know, how you're resourced, and obviously you're resourced from the UK government. Yeah. Do you feel you're adequately resourced, and what more can the Scottish government to do to assist you guys in Scotland so that we can regulate public authorities?
Yeah, obviously, our budget has not really increased in the last 6 years or so, and then the range of responsibilities has. So obviously, if we had more resources, we could expand our activities in all areas, including our regulation and enforcement activities. That's a matter for discussion with the UK government, which our board and chief executive have continuously. But we have to work within the envelope we've got. And as I say, that means we have to make careful decisions around what we choose to engage with. And obviously PSED is the topic of today, but there are loads of other things that we are doing under our strategic plan that we have to also look to as well, which is why we try to take the approach of proactive engagement with public authorities through either the provision of guidance or working with them, the examples I provided earlier, or, you know, always having that capacity to take them down a road of enforcement where that proves to be necessary. And yeah, I mean, we continue having to juggle and make those decisions. I mean, what can the Scottish Government do? Well, obviously they can advocate with the UK Government about that. But yeah, we have to operate within the world that we have at the moment.
Obviously, better joint working between the UK government and the Scottish government then, and obviously, you know, you've got the opportunity, you know, to state a case for further resources from the UK government. Yep. Okay. Yeah,
which I think our commissioners do very well, but obviously, you know.
I think some of the things that we sort of mentioned earlier about the Scottish Government providing leadership and the sort of regulations that the Scottish Government brings forward sort of address in areas that would help us to do our job are also important as well.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Back to yourself, convener. Cheers.
Okay, thank you. Just again, cognisant of time, we have our next witnesses waiting for our next panel also. But I'm going to bring in Pam Gossel, and then I believe we have a question from Tess White. Thank you.
Thank you, convener. I have one question, then a supplementary. I'll try and be fast. You said in your response to my colleague Tess White that the EHRC sent an update code of practice for services, public functions and associations to the UK government following the Supreme Court judgment in the For Women Scotland case.
Yes.
Has there been any further update from the UK government, and has there been any engagement with the Scottish government?
So, I think the situation is that the code is with the UK government. It's now a responsibility of UK ministers to take that forward. I know that our commissioners have been urging the UK government to do that as fast as they possibly can. They've asked for certain additional pieces of information which we are providing or have provided, but that's very much in their ballpark. And the other part of your question was
to do with have you been engagement with the Scottish government?
Our understanding is that the UK government, when we had submitted our draft code to them, shared that with the Scottish and Welsh governments in terms of consulting with them for their views. And our understanding is that government provided their views on the draft code. We haven't seen what their assessment of that was. But we understand that's what's happened. So the Scottish government have been consulted by the UK government on our draft code.
Okay, no, thank you. A little bit of a kind of technical supplementary here. Section 112, subsection 3 of the Equality Act 2010 states, B commits an offence if B knowingly or recklessly makes a statement mentioned in subsection 2A which is false or misleading in a material respect. Does the EHRC consider that public bodies and the government are potentially at risk of legal action if they continue to follow the 2011 Code of Practice, given that the Code is now clearly advising actions the Commission believes it is out of line with the law as clarified by the Supreme Court ruling? Having advised the Scottish Government that they must abide by the ruling, disregard the 2011 Code of Practice and not wait for the new code, do you consider civil servants or ministers might be committing an offence under section 112 subsection 3 if they fail to act in accordance with the law as clarified?
That's quite a detailed question. Thank you for that. I wonder whether it's appropriate if we would write to you about that rather than do a verbal response now, given time and the fact we would have to go and look at that reference. Yeah. If that's okay with you, could we write
it is a quite detailed area, because it's quite important to understand that are they breaking the law?
I just think probably it's better if we just go away and have a close look at that and respond to the committee or to yourself, or just is it a committee question?
We can do that.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Would that be helpful? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Are you content, member?
Yes, fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Tess,
Thank you,
please.
convener. And my final question, and thank you again for coming today, John and Jennifer. It really is appreciated. This report, a lot of work went into this, and I think there were 58 submissions, and there was so a huge amount of work and feedback went into it. So my final question, if the EHRC is truly independent, if it is the duty of all public bodies, and I've given the example of the ones in my own region, to comply with the Supreme Court ruling, why aren't the EHRC telling the Scottish Government, and you've mentioned about the lack of leadership, just telling them to just get on with it?
Well, I think I would say that's what we've done. Following the Supreme Court judgment, there have been various discussions between our former chair and chief executive with the Scottish Government, and our message has been to them and to all other public bodies that the judgment is there, and it's the responsibility of them and all other bodies to take appropriate steps that they need to comply with the implications of that judgment. and that while we will be working or have worked on the code, which hopefully will be laid shortly, and we'll be working on updating other relevant guidance, people should not be waiting for that. They should be taking appropriate steps.
But they are, John. They're waiting and they're in paralysis. So will you be telling them to get on with it?
As I say, that's our message to them, and in the meeting that we had yesterday, that was the message that we said again, that, you know, our view was we welcomed the report back on all the work that they said that they were doing in terms of looking at the implications and progressing as fast as they could. And that was our message, that that's what you need to do, and the Code of Practice will hopefully help when it comes, but you shouldn't be waiting for that.
And then you have enforcement powers. Will you be considering those enforcement powers?
In line with the answer I gave you earlier, we will, you know, if a matter is brought to our attention where duties are not being complied with in terms of the Equality Act, then we will triage that and we will consider it.
Thank you, Jennifer. This report is bringing it to your attention. We'll leave it with you, and we do expect follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. That brings this panel to a close. I want to thank the witnesses once again for their evidence today. We will suspend briefly while we have a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. Welcome back. We will now move on to our second panel, and I therefore welcome to the meeting Kokab Stewart, Minister for Equalities. The Minister is accompanied by Nick Bland, Deputy Director for Mainstreaming and Inclusion, and Vuyi Soodley, Solicitor from the Scottish Government's Legal Directorate. You're all very welcome, and thank you for attending the meeting this morning. Can I firstly invite the Minister to make an opening statement before we move on to questions from the rest of the committee? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the committee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss the report of your inquiry into the operation of the public sector equality duty in Scotland and my response. I also want to thank the stakeholders that gave evidence to the committee. Their insights add to the evidence about how the PSED works in practice, existing challenges, and, of course, how these can be overcome. There is a lot for us to cover today, and I welcome this discussion. I am committed to a respectful, fair, and diverse Scotland. The PZ and the Scottish specific duties are important tools in order to achieve that goal. I'm dedicated to demonstrating leadership to increase awareness of PZ and the SSDs across the public sector. It is vital that public bodies understand and meet their obligations under the Equality Act. I have championed equality and a culture of shared learning and accountability, including engaging with ministerial colleagues and running roundtable events for duty bearers and equality groups. I seek to make the most effective use of all available powers. Notably, I have used the power under Regulation 11 for the very first time, when I wrote to duty bearers on the 16th of December requiring them to consider our new equality and human rights mainstreaming toolkit. We must continue to make Scotland's collective response to PZ more effective. On the 8th of December, we published our proposals for PZ improvement activity until December 2029 in the Regulation 12 report. This is an important step towards that goal, which demonstrates our continued commitment. The report sets out a range of concrete actions to enhance leadership, capability and capacity in the public sector, with a focus on sharing good practice. And it highlights fostering good relations, one of the key themes in the committee's inquiry. Alongside the Regulation 12 report, we published an impressive suite of mainstreaming resources, which I am proud of. They should help further establish equality and human rights at the heart of public sector decision-making and service design. The suite includes Equality and Human Rights Mainstreaming Strategy, Presenting Principles and Drivers for Change, the Mainstreaming Action Plan, showcasing 61 actions to embed equality and human rights across government, and the online mainstreaming toolkit, featuring a self-assessment tool and over 100 practical resources to help duty bearers evaluate and strengthen their mainstreaming efforts. I welcome the committee's report's emphasis on fostering good relations. We continue to experience a regression on equality, diversity and rights around the world, where hate against already vulnerable groups is becoming increasingly normalised. This division and violence has no place in Scotland. Fostering good relations is crucial to a safe, respectful and inclusive Scotland, and that's why the Scottish Government is taking action. We have recently invested an additional £300,000 to strengthen community cohesion, partnering with the STV Children's Appeal to support grassroots projects that bring together people across generations, cultures and faiths. Our We Are Scotland media campaign celebrates diversity and shared values, reminding us that Scotland is stronger for the differences that shape us. In addition, we continue to directly support a wide range of community organisations through investing £7.9 million this year in crucial work relating to community cohesion to uphold rights across all protected characteristics, fight discrimination, advance equality and foster good relations. And this includes funding for interfaith dialogue and anti-racism work. We have established the Anti-Racism Observatory for Scotland, known as AROS, a national centre of excellence to tackle structural racism and promote inclusion, for which we will provide £3 million between now and December 2027. Embedding equality and human rights across the public sector is essential. The mainstreaming suite, our programme of PZ improvement and our work to foster good relations demonstrate our continued commitment to meaningful action and to making the most effective use of the powers that we have. We will continue to do so to make Scotland a fairer, safer and more inclusive place for everyone. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. We're now going to move on to questions from members. And just before I do, just a reminder that we need to be very cognisant of the time, and we have 60 minutes for this session. So if we just pay attention to that, so all members are able to come in with their questions. I'll be grateful for that. Thank you. I'm going to ask the first question, Minister. The committee did find that the PSED is not delivering on its aims for improved outcomes for people with protected characteristics. Why do you think that is?
Well, the PZ was introduced due to desire to see tangible improvements for our society, and this positive vision is clearly set out in the 3 underlying goals that I've already mentioned. And since the PZ was created as part of the Equality Act of 2010, we have seen significant improvements to some groups' experiences of equalities and rights. For example, we now have equal marriage, stronger hate crime laws, new domestic abuse laws, a more robust approach to using equality evidence, and significantly more investment in equality groups. However, being a due regard duty, the PZ itself is procedural. It cannot be used to require public bodies to act in certain ways beyond what may be provided under the Scottish specific duties, which are in themselves restricted due to the due regard part of the duty. I think that it might be helpful for the committee to sort of understand the interactions and the complexities there. So I'd like to bring in Vui, please, on this.
Yeah, so just to slightly revise some of what the Minister has already said, the public sector equality duty is a duty under Section 149(1) of the Equality Act 2010. It imposes a requirement on public authorities to have a due regard for 3 things. The first of those things is to eliminate discrimination, harassment and victimisation and any other conduct which is prohibited by the Equality Act. Secondly, to advance the equality of opportunities between those who share protected characteristics and those who don't. And finally, to foster good relations between those who share particular protected characteristics and those who don't. The key point is that this duty is not one that can require public authorities to take specific actions. Rather, public authorities are required to have a conscious approach to the manner in which they carry out their functions, and that conscious approach has to take into account those 3 needs that I've already highlighted. In Scotland, there's a further layer of legislation, and that is in the Equality Act 2010 Specific Duties Scotland, the 2012 regulations. Those do have some further requirements on public authorities, such as in relation to reporting, but that is within a wider framework which is restricted by the competence issues that are reserved to the UK government. In the event that that focus were to shift in any way, that would be incumbent on the UK government to bring in those changes.
And the only thing that I would add to that is that obviously on that backdrop, you know, in my role as Minister for Equalities, that visible leadership is key to drive that change, and I know that's an area of interest for the committee. I believe that I have consistently demonstrated that leadership to ensure that public bodies have that strong awareness of the requirements of the PZ, and that we all do, because it's a shared endeavour across all public sector sort of bodies in order to tackle that inequality across Scotland. And I'm sure we'll come into further questions down the line about building that strong awareness in public bodies of how important equality is for our society, paired with that understanding based on robust data and reporting where public bodies still have some way to go.
Thank you. We now move on to questions from Paul, please.
Yeah, thank you, Convener, and thanks, Minister. I raised this in the last panel with the HRC around about the mainstreaming strategy. And obviously, Kenny just to tell you, can you see where the role of local authorities, Kenny comes in public authorities in terms of that? I think there's a few things I think.
Sorry, can I just stop you? Could you just repeat that? I didn't catch you.
Yeah, the last committee had talked around about, the last panel session talked around about the role of mainstreaming. and the role of the HRC and also the Scottish Government. And it's really just to kind of focus on what your thoughts are in terms of public authorities' understanding of PZ and also of the mainstreaming. But for me, the key point is this shouldn't just be an add-on for public authorities. It should be an integral part of what they do. And where do you kind of see government's role in trying to promote that within the public authorities themselves, to take ownership of that, not just rely on guidance from government and rely on guidance from HRC, but they actually take that on and make sure that's an integral part of what they do?
Yeah, so that sort of, I can expand on the bit about providing that leadership in the mainstreaming. So, and I referred in my opening remarks about having that suite that we have published. So it's quite extensive, the stuff that we have published, and also using sort of like Regulation 11, using Regulation 12, and I've also taken part in sort of like equality outcomes. So the Scottish Government is leading by example. So we are responsible for setting our own equality outcomes. But we've done that in workshops, bringing in sort of stakeholders and sort of creating those outcomes together, because obviously it's incumbent upon all public sort of like authorities to public sector organisations actually to set their own equality outcomes. So if we're doing it alongside together and having that shared understanding, that builds that as well. Can I just bring in Nick very briefly on this as well, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we work very closely with the listed authorities, the public authorities who are required to operate under the public sector equality duty, as the Minister's setting out. There are a range of areas, both in terms of regulatory reform, but also in non-regulatory reform, where we're seeking to provide that leadership, that steer to public authorities. But they demonstrate to us a concern for that. You have groups like the Scottish Council's Equality Network, the NDBB Equality Forum. There are specific groups aimed at sharing practice and having that focus across sectors on equality issues. So we work closely with them. You're right that they have their own responsibility. They have their own legal responsibilities. They have their own aspirations and ambitions towards equality. So that's a dynamic relationship. But there's certainly a feeling from Scottish Government of onus on us, both in the regulatory and non-regulatory space, to be demonstrating the leadership that the Minister's been talking about.
Just a supplementary to that, Convener, if that's okay, and probably both to yourself, Minister, and to Nick. One of the points the HRC mentioned as well was about the existing inspection regimes within the public authorities, such as health, such as education, and so on. In terms of that, is there a role for them to make sure that the PSED duties are part of the inspection regimes? And you know, that's the point that was raised by that. And also the other key point I think is in terms of monitoring the role of government and how we monitor that, but not just government, it's the role of Parliament, this committee and its successive committees. Where do you kind of see Parliament and government almost monitoring that? But in terms of the current inspection regimes, what their role is in making sure that public sector bodies continue to do that as part of their existing inspection regimes?
You want to kick off on that and I'll come in?
Yeah, no, if I may say, I think it's a good point. The mainstreaming strategy sets out a framework of 6 drivers for change, and accountability is one of those 6 drivers. And scrutiny, inspection is a really important element. That framework demonstrates that our action to improve outcomes on equality is not. There's not a single kind of work. There's not a single improvement activity that's going to be successful. We have to work across those 6. So in relation to accountability and scrutiny, I don't think that, I can't speak for scrutiny bodies, but I don't think that scrutiny bodies would want to be getting close to looking at the application of PSED in terms of the boundaries with the HRC role. But certainly our engagement with scrutiny bodies is to encourage them to think about mainstreaming equality into their functions as much as into the functions of public authorities, service delivery organisations, and so on. So that's one of my responsibilities. Say we all have a role to play here, as you say, this committee, but scrutiny bodies also have a role to play from that accountability perspective.
Okay, Fiona, thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Marie McNair, please. Any? Are we able to get?
Apologies, convener,
That's okay.
for what was going on there. Good morning, Minister, and your officials. The committee report and your response both stress the importance of robust equality evidence. Can you say more about how the Scottish Government is improving the collection and analyses of equality duties?
Yep, I can do. Thank you. So I suppose the preparations for developing the third equality evidence strategy are underway, and we expect that a draft of the strategy to be ready for consultation by late November 2026, with a view to publishing the final strategy by March 2027. The third equality evidence strategy will be designed collaboratively with government analysts, policymakers and external organisations, including public authorities and bodies that are interested in improving equality evidence. The priorities for that third evidence strategy will be shaped through the evaluation of the second strategy, stakeholder engagement process and an internal audit of the Scottish Government data sets. So initial engagement suggests that some areas from the second strategy will remain a priority, such as encouraging opportunities to further intersectional further intersectional analysis. And an evaluation of the Scottish Government's current evidence strategy from 2023 to 2025 is now underway, and that is due for publication in spring 2026. And that evaluation will provide an assessment of improvements to the equality evidence base and identify areas for improvement to take forward as part of the next strategy.
Thank you. That's helpful. Kind of that assurance. Obviously, there's been an issue. Obviously, the kind of concern and challenge about data. So, I certainly welcome that. I don't know if the rest of the committee will, but hopefully that is the case. The Scottish Government response to the committee report also says that it may be complex to change the reporting cycles of the Scottish specific duties. Could you or your officials explain a bit further on the complexities?
Yes, so that's a good question to sort of highlight. Actually, the Scottish specific duties have a complex framework, and listed authorities in Scotland already have multiple other mandated reporting cycles to balance, and if reporting cycles change for the SSDs, this could impact the others. So they're all sort of interrelated in that sense. And that could, of course, cause duplication, increased administrative load, or misalignment with other statutory processes as well. So there are many factors that have to be carefully considered if we were to streamline the reporting process. Reporting cycles often align with regulatory requirements, governance frameworks, funding timetables, for instance, or indeed cross-departmental collaborations. And any adjustments, therefore, would require careful consideration and clear communication to avoid confusion or misalignment. And of course, we've got stakeholders who rely on reports for operational planning, and they may well resist changes if the new cycles make it harder for them to forecast and monitor performance. So managing these expectations is essential to minimise disruption and maintain trust, of course. So, as we continue to take a phased approach to PZ improvement, we will carefully consider how the reporting cycle could be improved, and this will include consideration of possible alignment with reporting requirements related to the new Human Rights Bill, for instance. And just to finish off for completeness, And one further complexity to note is that different public bodies have come on stream as duty bearers at different times as well, meaning that there's no single set of reporting dates. So this is also a factor that we would consider in any reviews of cycles.
Thank you. And with that, would continued engagement happen then with obviously stakeholders to keep them informed and hopefully also get feedback from them?
Well, yes. I mean, it is always our intention to continue engagement as widely as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener. That's me. Cheers.
Thank you. Minister, on the point of delivering on PSED aims, the committee's heard that there is an overemphasis on processes rather than outcomes. And I'm wondering, how will the Scottish Government be able to monitor whether public bodies are concentrating more on these outcomes?
Yes, and I, personally as well, it's well known that I'm very concerned. I concern myself with outcomes, and processes should help those outcomes, to achieve those outcomes. They shouldn't be hindering them or be overly cumbersome or, difficult to navigate. And, we're absolutely committed to advancing equality. And we know that the PZ is an example of an important levers that we have available to us. So we are leading, I think, by example to inspire other public bodies to put equality front and centre. But ultimately, we need to remember that it is for public bodies which are independent of government to set out what they intend to achieve and how they will do so. So me taking a leadership role in that, and you know that I take that very seriously, I have communicated this to a wide range of audiences and groups, both in person and in correspondence. In engaging with the PZ, we also have to be mindful of the limits on legislation competence of the form of this kind of framework, of course. And I know that VU has already sort of gone over some of that detail, so I won't report it. I won't sort of say it again, but it is a due regard duty, and we need to sort of remember that, that because it's a due regard duty, it is by its very nature a procedural duty. So this means that it's not an outcomes-focused in form, but I'm clear that the policy intention behind the PZ is substantive. And the Equality Act of 2010, in which it sits, was intended to be transformative when it was introduced. So it is a wide-ranging and ongoing duty to engage in conscious consideration of the three needs of the PZ. And we see that as a strength. And if it required a more narrow focus on identifying or achieving particular outcomes, we would see that as a limitation, actually, because it needs to be seen in the wider sense. I can go into further, should you wish to ask me anything further. Oh, yeah. Just like to come in.
Just to add to what the Minister's said, understandably, the committee's focus in this inquiry is around the public sector equality duty, but we continue to take a range of action across the protected characteristics in policy terms that are very much focused on improved outcomes for those groups. So, for example, the Disability Equality Plan, the Gypsy Travellers Action Plan. We've got a proposal for, not a proposal, we will have a gender equality strategy being published before the pre-election period. So outside of the specific work on the public sector equality duty, we also have these very action-focused plans for delivery, working with public authorities that are absolutely aimed on outcomes for those specific groups.
Thank you. Now move on to questions from Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks very much, Karen, and good morning, Minister. Thank you and your officials for being here this morning. I want to focus my questions on balancing protected characteristics and the fostering good relations element of PSED. But before I come to that, just really to pick up on what you've both just said in that final answer, and Minister, you referenced, you said earlier that the PSED is procedural. In the first panel this morning, we heard from the EHRC that there needs to be a shift away from thinking of it as procedural and using it as more of a tool. And I wonder what conversations you've had with EHRC about that and how that has informed your conversations with other public bodies as well as within the Scottish Government.
Yeah, can I bring in Nick?
Yeah, so I think there's an aspect of the public sector equality duty which is clearly legalistic, ensuring, as Scottish Government and public authorities, that they're meeting those statutory requirements. I always say in talking about this that's a floor, not a ceiling, for our ambitions in relation to equality. So there are requirements within that are helpful, but part of my early remarks where I talked about regulatory reform and non-regulatory reform, it's in that non-regulatory space that we see the importance of our action, and so the mainstreaming strategy, the mainstreaming action plan for Scottish Government action, our toolkit, is absolutely in that space for not simply focusing on that duty and its due regard status. And we've worked with the EHRC on most of that work, and they've sat on working groups for us, for example, on the mainstreaming toolkit. So we would share that view that from a legal perspective that's quite constrained, but that has not and does not stop what the Scottish Government is seeking to do in relation to advancing outcomes for around equality, as the Minister's been talking about.
Okay, thanks. I suppose it does represent a shift in focus for public bodies, I suppose, and when awareness is maybe not as high as it should be across the board. I think John used the phrase this morning, it's top and then stop. There might be good understanding at higher levels in certain public bodies, but it doesn't filter down all the way through. I think we've also seen the committee in our report saw very clear examples where people on the ground understood exactly what they should be doing, but were hampered by processes elsewhere. I think there is a shift that needs to happen away from it being a legalistic process thing to that tool. Anyway, moving on to questions around fostering good relations. Minister, you raised it in your opening remarks. It's been a bugbear of mine for a long time that it's very clearly the poorer cousin of the three pillars in PSED. And I just wondered how often in your conversations with ministerial colleagues do you talk about fostering good relations? Do you talk explicitly about that element of PSED?
Well, if I'm being honest, not enough. I mean, absolutely, we talk about it. There's no doubt about that. But I agree with your frustrations around that, especially at a time when we are seeing sort of quite divisive rhetorics that we are seeing, sort of like playing out. That kind of public discourse of pitting groups against one another, and that is not helpful at all. And actually, I would even, and I, reflected on this in my role as Minister. Obviously, I've got, sort of polarised and sort of the leadership role that I have in that. And I think I do my absolute best to make sure that all sort of discourse is conducted respectfully. Being mindful that we are protecting everybody across the protected characteristics. And I think I have said to the committee before that it's not a hierarchy of needs and it is not a pick and mix in that sort of situation either. And therefore, and also, I think, just to add to that, before I drill into some of the detail of what we have done in that area, is that kind of responsibility that actually all of us in this room are public sector workers. We're all part of that, so at every level, all of us who work for the public actually have a duty to foster good relations. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to reflect on how we are conducting ourselves and what is it that we are doing to actually make sure that we foster those good relations between the people that we serve in that way. So we need to be mindful of that. I mean, this year we have provided 7.9 million of funding across third sector organisations to support anti-racism work, interfaith dialogue, hate crime prevention, asylum and refugee integration projects. And I mentioned in my opening remarks part of that investment was our work into establishing the Anti-Racism Observatory of Scotland, which a national centre for excellence to tackle structural racism and promote inclusion. Once it's fully operational later this year, it is anticipated that AROS will focus on developing strategic partnerships across all sectors to collaboratively embed anti-racism change. This will include working collectively with third sector organisations to ensure that lived experience and co-production are at the heart of driving that meaningful change. I've mentioned that we've done that. The other thing recently, I was very mindful of, that kind of the tensions that can arise when people are feeling, that maybe their standard of living is plateaued, or resources can be scarce and tensions can arise. My opinion is that we all have more in common, that we actually all want the same thing. We all want access to good public services. We all want to feel a sense of belonging and to be included and not to be discriminated against and to have equality. We all want that. So in order to enhance the community cohesion in that space, I was able to secure £300,000 of additional funding, which is to directly support that community cohesion work and support projects which I'm hoping they'll be mainly grassroots projects within the heart of our communities that build strong, connected, resilient communities across the country. Because as far as I'm concerned, that is a must-have. We must have that.
Can I just on the community cohesion, that £300,000?
Yeah.
What can you give us a little bit more of a flavour of what some of those projects might be, or is it too early to say? I know because one of the challenges is, yes, the government says we've got this money for community cohesion, yeah, and people on the ground think, yeah, but what does that actually mean for them living in situations where there is conflict, there is tension, yeah, and they feel powerless to resolve that themselves? Yeah,
I thought about that very, very carefully, so it was one of the reasons why we partnered with STV Children's Appeal to distribute that funding, mm-hmm, because they are an organisation that already has those well-established links. They support a wide range of organisations. Often they're very small. They're based in local community, mm-hmm, centres. They may be like a coffee morning drop-in thing. They may be sports opportunities. It may be a knit and natter, dancing workshops, all craft, arts, all sorts. So that gives you a flavour. That's not exhaustive, by the way, but that is a flavour of some of the local groups. Some of them are only 2 or 3 people. Other organisations are bigger. And with a little bit of extra money goes a long way for these organisations to provide that space. It may be a booking in a community centre that they need. It may be to pay for the teas and coffees. It may be to pay for staff training in order to be able to have constructive conversations around issues that are causing tensions within communities, so people can discuss those concerns in a constructive manner with people who can support them through that, through a trauma-informed approach. So it's creating those the safe spaces already exist in, so it's enhancing that funding for them. So I was very cognizant that there is brilliant work that is already happening, but because of the additional challenges that we're facing in fostering good relations in the community cohesion space, the extra funding was required in order to enhance those opportunities and provide further opportunities. So we're talking about bringing people together so they can speak to each other, communicate, because we know that the more people get to know each other, the more we dispel these myths and we break down those barriers, we can deal with misinformation and disinformation and get into the heart of the communities where people are having those conversations.
Thanks, and I appreciate the examples you gave are just indicative, so yeah. I understand it's not an exhaustive list, but I suppose one of my concerns with that is, I mean, that work is really valuable and it's really, really important, but it's opt-in. And I suppose one of the challenges is how do you see that money or those resources and the ability to have those conversations getting into communities who actually don't want to know? Where they may be generations of disenfranchisement. There may be a whole series of situations that have led people to think, actually, there is nothing good that can come from me engaging with the state in a meaningful way. Yeah. And I suppose it's how do we use, how do we tackle the structural barriers here that are preventing the fostering of good relations? Because you can say, yes, let's have an Itinata group, but it's not the people who need to come necessarily that will come. So how do we get to how do we make sure that it's not just an opt-in, the people who are maybe already interested in these kinds of spaces, these kinds of conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know, that is a really, really good question. I'm not going to name any specific organisations. I'll just give you a general overview. So I was able to visit a wide variety of organisations that are already based in the heart of our communities. And one of the reasons why I'm not mentioning their names is because, unfortunately, because of the work that they do, some of them in the anti-racism space in particular, then subsequently have drawn negative attention and they have, in fact, been targeted, which I want to avoid, right? And it was one of the questions that I asked them, how do we reach the people that we need to reach, that feel disenfranchised? And I have to say that I was reassured that actually, you know, these organisations are based in the heart of the communities. It's one of the reasons why we are not, the government, we're not distributing this fund. You know, it's the STV who already have sort of extensive networks. They're very experienced in doing this work and creating new opportunities as well as enhancing sort of current opportunities. And some of the examples that the organisations gave me was that they have outreach workers that actually do sort of like go into the heart of communities and communicate with people. Now, wherever the touch points are. So if there, you know, people are bound to be attending a centre of some sort, whether that might be a leisure centre, it might be a GP surgery, it might be shopping centres. So to be able to have people that are able to have those conversations, and when they have those conversations and people are expressing their concerns or their views, they are able then to either signpost or to have those difficult conversations, and it is very skilled work, which is why in order to get the fund, I mean, you know, some people might be applying for 50 quid, some people might be applying for much further. There was no sort of there was no prerequisite to that, because I wanted it to be as flexible as possible, as responsive as possible, and as accessible as possible to be able to reach those very people.
Okay. Do I have time for one last question? My last question really, and I suppose it's a follow-on from that, having people who can get into the middle of things, as it were. One of the frustrations I think that we've seen, that I've been part of community discussions, is a perceived lack of awareness or lack of understanding by police officers who, you know, say they are balancing people's rights, they are balancing different groups, and that attempt to balance actually creates more conflict because they don't see them acting on, you know, racist attacks on people of colour who just happen to be walking past at the moment, or much more targeted attacks. So what is the how do we bring Police Scotland into some of that, because they are in every community, and how do we make sure that balancing isn't used as an excuse to do nothing?
Yeah, no, yes, I get what you're saying in that sense. We do have policing by consent, and I'm sort of like, you know, very pleased about that approach. Community police officers, I mean, certainly as an MSP, I represent, you know, the city centre of Glasgow currently, and Kelvin as well, and that contact that I have extensively with sort of like local police representatives to have that opportunity to be able to raise the concerns of my constituents, who sometimes do raise the concerns that, you know, you've raised yourself in that manner. Now, the police are covered by the public sector equality duty as well. So they have, you know, their own due regards that they have to fulfil as well. They are, of course, totally independent, you know, as well. Can I bring in Nick?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'll bring.
Yeah, just to give it a few more illustrations. So, I mean, there's the particular situations of policing protest, where I think you would hear the police being very careful about their allowing that to happen, where you may have sides where, in a sense, that could crystallise fostering good relations. You would hear this better from Police Scotland themselves, but I'm aware, having spoken recently to the lead for their Policing Together strategy, that they've got dedicated specialist officers whose role is to be engaging with communities and to doing some of this community cohesion work. So that might be seen as an illustration of a recognition of some of those issues. You know, you've got the officers on the beat, but you've also got these specialist officers who are doing that. Our reception from communities in relation to the last year or so, where this has been so heightened, has been a sense that they felt very well supported by Police Scotland. And Police Scotland have been very attentive to that, which is not to say, I'm sure they wouldn't say, that there's not improvements that they could make. I mean, just to broaden it out from Police Scotland, you know, we've recognised that we can be more explicit as a government about the importance of fostering good relations within the PSED framework. That's why it's in there as one of our elements of the Regulation 12 proposals. And just by way of a kind of related example, we worked with COSLA to produce a hate crime toolkit, which was published just before Christmas, and in developing that, that very much points to fostering good relations and that PSED framework. So for local authorities who, with Police Scotland in local areas, are a really crucial partner, then that's an illustration of activity to make that emphasis, to give that emphasis. And Police Scotland are a really important partner for us on our strategic partnership group for the delivery of the hate crime strategy and the delivery plan. So they're absolutely active in this space, notwithstanding, you know, the examples that you cite.
No, thanks, that's helpful. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Now I have questions from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister, and good morning, officials. I've just got a couple of questions. Minister, in their submission to the committee, Murray, Blackburn and Mackenzie warned that Scottish public authorities are failing to meet their existing obligations in relation to protections for women and girls, and that failure to get the law right here carries a cost to the public purse, as it is likely that most cases will be brought against Scottish public bodies. We saw this with Sandy Peggy case, for Scotland lodging legal action over school and prison guidance, and the Darlington nurses in England. Are MBM wrong to say that failure to properly implement the law could lead to more legal battles and thus to more taxpayers' money wasted?
Well, we've been clear since the Supreme Court ruling that we accept that judgment, and we as a government are taking forward that detailed work that is necessary as a consequence of that. And I'd like to remind the committee that it is the statutory role of the Equality and Human Rights Commission to monitor and enforce the compliance of the Equality Act 2010, given that they are the regulator of that Act. And I have been very clear, we expect everyone to follow the law. There is no ambiguity about that whatsoever. And I have said that repeatedly in my answers in the Chamber and indeed in front of the committee. So the Supreme Court ruling gave a clarification, but not the how. In that sense. So from our point of view of the work that we've been undertaking on sort of like scrutinising that and making sure that everything aligns, a working group was established, originally known as the Short Life Working Group, but obviously it has taken further time, so now known as the Working Group. That is convened by the Permanent Secretary, and that was established to consider the implications of the Supreme Court judgment in areas such as legislation, guidance and policies. So I think that it might be helpful to give a sort of like a summary update of the work that we have undertaken, because I know that you'd be very interested on, a question often put is like, well, what have you done? You've done nothing. Well, that I don't believe that that is true at all. We have sort of like progressed in what is quite an extensive area, and I note that the HRC acknowledge the fact that it is a huge estate and there are many areas to consider, and we are proceeding through that work systematically. So to date, the Scottish Government we've updated our guidance on the Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Act of 2018. We have also amended the public appointments recruitment process for public bodies subject to the Act, now collating and using biological sex at birth data to apply the Act. We've moved to an interim trans and non-binary inclusion policy for the Scottish Government staff, removing a line regarding facilities use, whilst we develop new policy and guidance on consultation with trade unions. We've also published revised supporting transgender pupils in schools guidance, while recognising that, of course, the EHRC are also reviewing technical guidance for schools. We've also advanced joint work with Police Scotland with a public consultation on the Stop and Search Code of Practice to be issued shortly. We've also actively engaged with health boards. On the 30th of September 2025, the Director of Health Workforce wrote to health boards to reinforce the importance of ensuring that the law is followed and that the Supreme Court judgment is implemented. Application of the law following the Supreme Court ruling remains a matter for boards, of course, in accordance with their own legal advice. And furthermore to that, we conducted an initial review of facilities across the Scottish Government estate, with a more detailed review now underway to ensure that our provision meets the needs of staff and legal requirements. So our approach is focused on ensuring accuracy and clarity, avoiding unnecessary sort of complexity or confusion, indeed, at a time of heightened public debate. But of course, just to pick up on a bit of what you said about legal challenges, of course, can come from all directions as well. So, legal challenges occur. That is a right for people to be able to test the law, and I have no you know, we would all support everybody's right to uptake their legal sort of rights that they have in that space. But it is important also to remember that, you know, in the ruling of the Supreme Court judgment, it was stated that it was not to be seen as a victory of one group against another in that sort of space. And we must also be cognizant that everybody has a right as well across all the protected characteristics. So it's making sure that whilst we are absolutely following the law, and I've made it clear, I'll emphasise it again, I expect everybody to follow the law, we must also make sure that we are not excluding people from their basic rights as well. So we need to find that way forward, that everybody's human rights are protected, because I'm sure nobody in this committee would want to have one group excluded and marginalised and all the rest of it for the sake of another. We are able to actually find solutions to this. We are able to do that. I do believe that.
Well, Minister, it's good to hear that you're accepting the judgment and that you know that you want to follow the law. But Minister, it's recently emerged that SNP ministers have issued a declaration of incompatibility with regard to the Supreme Court's judgment for the For Women Scotland case. Why is the Scottish Government seeking to undermine the law by putting the rights of dangerous criminals who claim to be women above the rights of some of the most vulnerable women?
I'm going to stick with the protocol of the Scottish Government. I'm not going to make any comment on any proceedings that are in court.
Okay. I'm just asking that question because you were very clear on the fact that you're accepting the judgment and the fact that you're following the law. This clearly states that you're not following the law. And I know you said earlier on the word how, but how is how interpreted by the Scottish Government? The law is the law. The Supreme Court judgment was very, very clear, and hence why I'm asking you these questions today, Minister.
It's fair enough to ask the questions, Ms Gosel. I know respectfully have listened to your question. I have given you an answer, and any discussions regarding the law with regards to any court cases, they are best conducted within that court setting, and it's only right that they are discussed there, and that is fair to both sides, to the litigants and to the presenters.
Okay, thank you. It's also emerged that the Scottish Government has allocated £13 million of taxpayers' money to LGBT Youth Scotland. LGBT Youth Scotland has begun operating in primary schools, something I have been contacted about by many concerned parents from my area, East Dunbartonshire. Apart from the LGBT Youth Scotland, LGBT Youth Scotland refuses to abide by the Supreme Court ruling on the definition of the word women. So why is the Scottish Government providing funding to this organisation that refuses to follow the law, and what are the Government's procurement rules when it comes to handing out money to such organisations?
Our Equality and Human Rights Fund continues to advance equality for those with protected characteristics, and we support 47 organisations that make a difference to people's lives. And this, of course, includes working with a range of LGBTQI+ organisations to help shape policy and practice to improve outcomes for LGBTQI communities. And this is particularly important at a time when we are seeing a rising attacks against the members of that community. Now, these organisations receive funding to create lasting improvements in the lives of LGBTQI+ people in Scotland, including the funding that is being referred to, providing funding to LGBT health and wellbeing to support their LGBT plus helpline, which provides emotional support and information to LGBTQI+ people. And I have said to the committee before that, especially in the, we're talking about 0.44% of the population here as well. Very small body of people. often can be mischaracterised, misrepresented, and draw quite a disproportionate scrutiny on their lives, which is having a detrimental impact on their health and well-being. I mean, for instance, that helpline saw a spike of, I mean, I can't remember off the top of my head what the percentage was, of sort of calls of from people who were vulnerable and considering suicide, for instance. That is horrendous. That is horrendous. So we are funding that suicide support helpline in order to reach the very people that are in the spotlight and are needing that support. So we've also, through the funding, commenced initiatives such as supporting the ending of conversion practices through legislative and non-legislative measures, advancing non-binary equalities, supporting policy development for LGBTQI people, and research into the lives of those within those communities. Now, all organisations that receive Scottish Government funding are subject to monitoring and evaluation to ensure that they are meeting their stated outcomes. We have no concerns about the performance of LGBTQI organisations in delivering those outcomes for the communities they represent. And I just want to reassure you that we fund specific pieces of work that I have outlined, and organisations sort of like they have, you know, they do many sort of like things. For instance, we have organisations in the disability field, you know, the disabled people's organisations. We procure certain services that they deliver for us that achieve the aims that we want to achieve, right? And then they do their other work as well.
Sorry, Minister, sorry to interrupt you there, but I have to be very clear here what the question was about. The question was about LGBT Youth Scotland, who refuses to abide by the Supreme Court ruling on the definition of the word woman. You mentioned earlier on very clearly that, you know, you want to follow the law, you accept the judgment. This organisation is refusing to do that. What kind of example is that setting to the children, that you're bringing in an organisation to deliver to young children in schools, an organisation that doesn't abide by the law? And I wouldn't be bringing this up if parents hadn't brought it up in Eastern Bartonshire. They're very concerned. I got another email today as well, you know, and I've brought this up many times. They're very concerned about this organisation, whilst I know a lot of the good work that goes in, and the clarity about understanding different backgrounds, and it's important. But this organisation is refusing to abide by the law. That's not a good example to be setting those children, to say that we're actually paying £13 million out to somebody that actually doesn't want to abide by the law.
The fund that you're referring to supports 47 organisations. I think it's important to emphasise that. We have previously engaged with LGBT Youth Scotland to determine facts around various media reports. What you're referring to now is what you're presenting to me. I have no way of fact-checking that in live time. But sort of like previously, you know, it is an organisation that has been in the spotlight and does get a lot of attention. I have visited the organisation. I have spoken to the users of that organisation, and I have seen firsthand the good work that they are doing in supporting young people in various ways. As a constituency MSP, I have also had communications from parents who have been grateful for the work that they have done in increasing awareness, supporting parents, also sort of supporting youngsters. So there is a wide variety of work that is going on there. I have been assured that LGBT Youth Scotland have strengthened their safeguarding policies to ensure that they are in line with legislation and they meet the national standards. And they, of course, continue to review those policies annually to make sure that they are as comprehensive as possible.
Just one last question. I asked earlier on to the earlier panel a question around data, and it was emphasised that the fact that there was a big gap in data and a lot of work needs to be done around it, and the fact that we need to be collecting the right sort of data as well. Do you agree that it is important to be collecting data on biological sex for equality monitoring, and will you be withdrawing the 2021 guidance which still encourages data collection based on self-ID?
Sort of like my answer to that is that I sort of like, you know, I'm very much in line with the EHRC on this, is that we know that good quality and robust data is really, really important. We know that because we shape our services around it. You know, we can forward plan on it, we can sort of allocate funding. There's loads of good reasons for that. Absolutely, we need to do that. We also need to remember that the data that we collect, there has to be good reasons for collecting that data, because people have to offer that data. You know, I mean, nobody could force any one of us in this room to actually declare anything about ourselves that we don't wish to. Right? I know myself when I filled in sort of like the additional forms that go along with recruitment processes, for instance, and there's the bit about, you know, which ethnic minority do you belong to? Would you do that? I know on occasion that I possibly haven't filled that in. So we need to make sure that people are engaged with giving their data and knowing then and having some confidence in I suppose, having some confidence that their data will be used appropriately and proportionately for the purpose for which it is collected. So that is what I'm saying on that just now. I don't know if there's anything else.
Just to be specific, the Office of the Chief Statistician is currently reviewing its guidance on collecting data on sex and gender identity in light of the Supreme Court judgment. So that work's continuing.
Okay. No, thank you for that information. Sorry, Convener, I know.
Just to note, we are really running out of time, and we still have the member Tess White to come in and ask her question, and we have to be quite sharp.
Okay, I've got a quick, sharp question in relation to Minister. It's been almost a year since the Supreme Court ruling on the definition of the word woman, and yet little progress has been made. Last month, I met with the Chief Constable, Joe Farrell, who said that Police Scotland did not wait for any guidance from the Scottish Government, but rather produced their own guidance, which is in accordance with the Supreme Court judgment and places an emphasis on biological sex as opposed to gender identity. Why haven't other public bodies done the same?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of other public bodies. I can't, yeah. I mean, you'd have to ask them.
You wouldn't be guiding them, Minister, as the Scottish Government?
And we have made it very, very clear. I have said, as I said, and thank you for the opportunity to restate again, that the Scottish Government accepts the Supreme Court ruling. We expect everyone to comply with the law.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you.
And now bring in Tess White, please.
Good afternoon, Minister.
Yes, indeed.
We welcome the fact that you've said that no one wants anybody to be excluded. And we also welcome the fact that you said that you want to follow the law, the Scottish Government wants to follow the law. This morning we had a very important session with the EHRC, and they actually said that basically a lot of the leadership resides with the Scottish Government on this, but accepting your point about monitoring and enforcement. So I suppose before I go into my main questions, just a comment, is Vuyi talked about the Hate Crime Act and mentioned, and a comment, if nobody's going to be included, then sex is excluded from the Hate Crime Act. I think it's important to state that point. Vuyi, did you want to say anything?
Sorry, just to note that I'm not sure I did make any reference to the Hate Crime Act.
Okay, thank you.
Earlier on, apologies.
So, bearing in mind, I'm just building on my colleague Pam Gossall in terms of the justice, and I talked to the EHRC about the short-term working group, and I did look at it on the website last night, but it's sort of stalled. I've got two questions about that. It was supposed to meet every 2 weeks, and then it met every month, and then nothing the minutes haven't been shared since August. What's your role on that short-term working group? Have you met with it? No. And then my second question, Minister, is in relation to justice and the overlaps of the PSED, is have you met with the Secretary, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice in relation to the requirements of the public sector equality duties? Have you had separate meetings with Angela Constance about this? No. Okay, thank you. I do want to talk about justice, but first I want to mention the swimming pools example in leisure centres, and I focus on that. And we did cover it at some length, so I'm assuming that you sort of watched it this morning. And I quoted sort of Stonehaven swimming pool as an example. Women and girls self-exclude from swimming when they cannot access single-sex spaces. And I gave an example from Stonehaven. And this disproportionately affects
I can,
women.
Just to help you,
yes.
I did actually see that bit.
Great.
So...
Well, I'm not going to go into it, don't worry.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say, my question is, this disproportionately affects women with religious or cultural requirements, survivors of trauma, and women who simply need privacy from the opposite sex. So this does directly undermine the Scottish Government's efforts to increase female participation in sport and physical activity. And I quoted the inquiry that the Health and Sports Committee did and has a section on this very subject. And it is, what's happening is in many cases incompatible with the public sector equality duty. So my question is how will the government measure whether current leisure provision is advancing equality of opportunity for women and girls, particularly those who require single-sex spaces for cultural, religious, and both physical and psychological safety reasons?
I think sort of like with respect, I think to drill down on that question, that would be a better question for the Minister for Sport, I think, who would have more of an in-depth. However, I would like to offer a short view just to provide you with some reassurance of my understanding around this. Especially when it comes to women from an ethnic minority, not exclusively intersectional with communities of faith. And certainly I have had representations from Muslim women and young girls who wish to have single-sex swimming sessions in order to make sure that, they learn to swim. I mean, it's really important. I mean, I remember myself sort of like way back when we didn't have as many sort of like, advanced thinking on this, that everyone should be entitled to be able to learn to swim. And sadly, I was excluded. I wasn't allowed to attend swimming classes when I was at school. And I know that carried with me because I was never a confident swimmer. So it's something that, I'm very, very aware of through my own lived experience. And what I always encourage people to do, and I've given advice to constituents who have come to me and made representations, is to make sure that they work with the people who are in charge of the leisure centre, whoever that may be, whether it's the local authority or whomever, to make sure that, again, that balance can be struck, that actually there is space in the timetabling or whatever the logistics are to make sure that there are protected sessions where whomever wishes to have that safe space in order to be able to learn to swim, in this particular example, is able to do that. Because the overarching need is sort of, health and safety as well, and being able to stop yourself from drowning, and, it's a life skill in order to do that. So I absolutely sympathise with where you're coming from. And my view is embedded is that actually I would just add to that is that all the protected characteristics deserve that same right. And I'll refer you back to what I said earlier, is that it shouldn't be seen as a competition with either. I think if your intent is to include, which it should be, then we should. But we absolutely recognise that there are times when people need those spaces in order to be able to sort of be themselves, whether it to be learn to swim or whatever. We are able to do that.
And thank
Excuse
you,
me,
Minister.
could I just come in on that point, just to note that we have gone 5 minutes over the Minister's time, so before you come back in, just to make sure you're comfortable if Tess wants a follow-up on that.
Apologies, Convener, I was invited to come between 11 and 12, so I did schedule sort of like an extra half hour on top of that, and now we're over that as well. So can I just say that if there are any further questions that you feel that you do need answers on, then as always the committee are always happy to write to me, and I'm happy to supply that information in writing.
And Minister, I would like to say on the record that we have not been given sufficient time. I have some key questions that I've wanted to raise with you that I haven't been able to raise about the balance of rights, that one person's rights are outweighing another person's rights. And I would like to say for the record, I have asked the committee that I said it wasn't enough time. I asked for the committee if we could have a follow-up, and I just think that this has been squeezed in, and it is disrespectful to the inquiry that we did, and I would like to register my complete dissatisfaction that I have not been able to ask you, the Minister, the questions that I've been able to ask. And sending you in writing is just not good enough.
Convener, could I just sort of like very briefly, I'd like to comment on that. Obviously you're addressing your remarks and you're registering your dissent to me.
Not
however,
dissent, dissatisfaction, Minister.
but it's not within my gift in that control. Can I just say that sort of like in the short time that I have had, it has been unfortunate that I have not also been able to sort of go into Regulation 11, which I was able to use for the first time. I have not had the opportunity or been asked about the use of Regulation 12. I have also not had the opportunity to talk about our mainstreaming toolkit. So there have been many areas that I have not been able to cover that come under the inquiry and the public sector equality duty.
So on that basis, Minister, will you meet with this committee again before the end of parliamentary term to raise all those issues that you want to raise with the committee that you've just mentioned, and also to allow us to ask you and to give us the courtesy to ask you to go through the questions that we wanted to ask you today?
Can I interject
Ms White, respectfully,
there?
that is not within my scope. That is for the committee to decide.
It's for the committee
but
to
you
decide,
would be willing.
absolutely. And I invite the member to bring that up with the rest of the committee, and we'll have those discussions. I want to thank you, Minister, and your officials for joining us today. And that brings us to a conclusion of our session in public. We will now go into private to discuss the remaining items on our agenda. Thank you.